Hello, and welcome to the first podcast of the heart. Before we actually do the heart, let's look at the arteries and capillaries and veins. So, major arteries will leave the heart and take blood to other body parts, and veins will bring blood back to the heart. So, let's look at the structure of the arteries and the veins. So, if you look at the cartoon, on the left side is an artery, and you can see it's got three tunics. There's a tunica interna, which is the innermost tunic. There's a tunica media, which is the middle tunic, or tunic is Latin for coat. And then there's a tunica externa, which is the external layer of the blood vessels. And you can see within the tunica interna that innermost layer is composed of an endothelium, and the endothelium is composed of endothelial cells. So all blood vessels and the chambers of the heart are lined by the cell type called an endothelial cell. And then any cell, including an endothelial cell, has to sit on something. So those endothelial cells are sitting on a layer called the subendothelial layer. So you can see that structure in the cartoon. That subendothelial layer is usually a loose connective tissue that is the sort of a membrane or some sort of floor that the endothelial cells sit on. And then also within the tunica interna, but only in the arteries, is this structure called an internal elastic lamina. And you can see it kind of looks like a Swiss cheese. And it's made of elastic tissue. So arteries, because they expand with a pulse of blood, you need an elastic layer there to help bring the blood vessels back to their pre-expansion state. So then more superficial to the tunica interna is the tunica media. And you can see in the cartoon both the arteries and veins have a tunica media. And there's two cell types in the tunica media. One cell type is smooth muscle cells, and then the other cell type is fibroblasts. So fibroblasts make the collagen and elastin that are the molecules of the tunica media, and then the smooth muscle cells in the tunica media are actually able to constrict or relax, causing the blood vessel to, in the case of a vasoconstriction, the blood vessel will constrict. In the case of vasodilation, the blood vessel will dilate or relax or get bigger. And then within the tunica media, also in arteries only, is the external elastic lamina, and you can see that looks like Swiss cheese again, and that is also made of elastic tissue like the internal elastic lamina is. And then the external, or the tunica externa, the cell type that lives in the tunica externa, again, is a fibroblast cell making collagen and elastin, and mostly collagen to form sort of a protective coat. And then between the arterial side and the venous side of the vascular tree is the capillary network. And we've talked about that before. That's in the capillaries, that's where things can be exchanged. And again, if you look at the bottom of the cartoon, those cells that are lining the lumen or the inside of the capillary are endothelial cells. And then the endothelial cells have to sit on a subendothelial layer. So it tells you here that arteries carry high pressure blood away from the heart. So when the heart beats, there's a high pressure in the blood that's leaving the heart. Arteries have a thicker wall, and you can see that in the cartoon. And then after the pulse of blood goes through the artery, they'll recoil. That term recoil is due to the internal and external elastic lamina that allows recoil. So if you think about stretching a rubber band, and when you let go, it snaps back. That's recoil. And then we talked about how the capillaries are where you exchange materials. And then it says that the capillaries are made of thin walls with simple squamous. So histologically, the cell type within the blood vessels is simple squamous, but that simple squamous, specifically because it's in blood vessels and within the chambers of the heart, it's called endothelial cells. The veins are returning blood to the heart. It's a lower pressure side, so they don't have to have as thick a wall as the arterial side does. But if you look on the right side of the cartoon, you can see valves. So when blood is flowing against gravity toward the heart, it'll tend to backflow a little bit, but the veins will catch that backflow so that blood doesn't always drain to your feet. The heart's a double pump, so in other words, you're at the same time you're pumping blood in the systemic circuit out to all your tissues, you're also pumping blood to the lungs, and that's the pulmonary circuit. So, and we'll look at the different chambers inside the heart, but generally the left side of the heart pumps blood to the systemic circuit, which includes all your tissues. And in the cartoon it shows a basketball player, and she's got all her tissues are receiving oxygenated blood and giving off blood that is high in CO2. And then the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs, and that's the pulmonary circuit. And what you also need to know is when you're looking at these cartoons, you've got to realize that your right side is your right side is actually the left side of the heart in the diagram, and your left side, as you're looking at the diagram, is actually the right side of the heart. So what you want to do is picture yourself standing like that basketball player whenever you look at these diagrams of the heart, and realize that the right and left sides are opposite of the way you're facing the cartoon. So in the pulmonary circuit, then, I told you the blood flows from the right side of the heart through the pulmonary trunk, which is that blue structure coming out of the heart. That's the pulmonary trunk. And it takes the deoxygenated blood, or blood that's low in oxygen and high in CO2, takes that blood to the lung capillaries, where oxygen moves into the blood and carbon dioxide moves out. And then the blood comes back via 4 pulmonary veins, which are those 4 red structures, or those 4 red tubes in the cartoon going into the heart. And then the systemic blood goes from the left side of the heart through the aorta, which is that major red blood vessel coming out of the heart in between the 2 blue vessels, goes out to the body capillaries, and then the oxygen poor CO2 rich blood comes back via the superior vena cava, which is on the right side of the heart, and then the inferior vena cava is also on the right side of the heart, just below the heart. And then also there's a third circuit, the coronary circuit, that takes blood out of the aorta and goes into the heart muscle itself, and we'll have a separate podcast on that. So if you take a heart and do kind of a coronal section through it and look inside, you see there's 4 chambers, and I've got listed the RA, LA, RV, and LV. So the RA is the right atrium, the LA is the left atrium, the RV is the right ventricle, and the LV is the left ventricle. So in other words, there's 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricle. And then there's the great vessels coming out of the heart. So that major red blood vessel in the cartoon is the aorta. And then the blue blood vessel that's coming out of the right ventricle is the pulmonary trunk, and goes into the pulmonary trunk morphs into pulmonary arteries. And then those 4 red tubes behind the heart are the pulmonary veins, bringing the oxygenated blood back into the left atrium. And then the superior and inferior vena cava are those blue tubes going into the right atrium. So the atria, both the right atria and the left atria, collect blood, and it says here from the SVC and the IVC, that's the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. They also collect, the right atria, the two atria collect blood from the pulmonary veins, those four red tubes behind the heart, and the atria, the right atria, also collects blood from the vasculature that's supplying the heart muscle itself. And then the ventricles are the two chambers that pump the blood. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps blood through the aorta. And then there's the listings of the blood vessels. This is a cartoon of the pulmonary circulation. So if you look at the heart part of the cartoon, you find the right atrium and the right ventricle, and you can see that from the right ventricle, the oxygen poor, CO2 rich blood, or blue blood, flows through the pulmonary trunk into the right and left pulmonary arteries, because remember, arteries always leave the heart and veins always bring blood back to the heart. But this is a little tricky because in the pulmonary circulation, the arteries, which usually carry red blood, the arteries are carrying blue blood or low oxygen blood to the lungs so that the lungs can oxygenate the blood. Anyway, so the pulmonary arteries take blood to the lungs, and then there's different names for the level of the arteries as they go into the lungs. You don't have to know those. But in the upper right portion of the cartoon, at some point the pulmonary arteries will morph into capillaries, and that's where oxygen and CO2 can exchange. So in the cartoon it says there's an air-filled alveolus of the lung. So the lung is full of these little grape-like structures called alveoli. We'll talk more about those with the respiratory system. But you can see in the cartoon that oxygen is coming in from the atmospheric air, going into the alveoli, and then going into the pulmonary capillary. And carbon dioxide is leaving the pulmonary capillary, going into the alveolus, and then you'll breathe out that carbon dioxide. As you know, you breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. And I think that's the last slide.